everyone. This is Rebecca King with the National Housing Conference. We're going to go ahead and get started with our July meeting of the Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force. Thanks for joining us today. Before I dive into, or we start policy updates, excuse me, I'll let Caitlin introduce herself to you.
Hi everyone, this is Caitlin Snyder. I'm a Policy and Research Associate here at the National Housing Conference.
And Caitlin's going to start with our policy updates today.
Great, so our first policy update is around appropriations. So there are just 7 working days left before House members and Senate members leave for the July 15th recess for party conventions. And with 7 working days, it's unlikely that the House is going to vote on the THUD bill. So we're expecting to see a continuing resolution, and lawmakers are currently debating about how long that continuing resolution should be. So one option is to have the continuing resolution start in September and end in December. And the other option is to have it start in September but kick it out till March until they have elected a new president, and then it becomes the new president's budget and just begins the whole budgetary cycle again. So keep your ears and eyes open as we expect to see the continuing resolution, and it's just a matter of how long that continuing resolution will be. And then our next update is around HR 3700, also known as the Housing Opportunity Through Modernization Act. So as folks may remember, this bill was passed unanimously in the House in February of 2016. And Senators Scott, Menendez, Blunt, and Coons have introduced a Senate companion bill. It's S3083 for anybody that is really interested in it. And so we're expecting them to pass the bill. Again, we don't expect it to pass in the next 7 working days before the July 15th recess, but we will expect them to pass it. And if your organization is interested in doing advocacy or outreach around the bill, you can contact me, and we'll make sure to include my contact info along with the legislation with notes from today's meeting. And then finally, an update on the Housing Choice Voucher Program administration fees. So HUD recently, I think today, issued a proposed rule that would adopt a new methodology for determining the administrative fee that public housing agencies receive. So under the old formula, they were funded by the number of vouchers that were under lease and a percentage of the local fair market rent. And so they are proposing to update the formula based on a recent study completed by Act Associates. And so the new formula would be based on program size, wage rates, benefit load, percent of households with earned income, new admission rate, and percent of assisted households that live in a significant distance from the PHA's headquarters. So the rule is available in the Federal Register, and we will make sure to send it also in the notes. Also, I should note the proposed rule will allow HUD to provide additional fees for special voucher programs like HUD Bash. And so comments are due on October 4th this year if you are interested. And like I said, we'll include the information in the notes.
Thanks, Caitlin. And just a quick housekeeping note before I go into a couple other policy updates is if you have questions as we go along, please send them through the chat box at any time. And I'm going to touch on the small area FMR proposed rule and a bill in the Senate from Senator Menendez. And then we have Sarah Edelman from the Center for American Progress to give an update on HUD's recently announced changes to the Distressed Asset Stabilization Program, just to give you a quick overview of where we're headed since I neglected to do that opening of the meeting. So diving right into small area FMRs, HUD has proposed a rule that would replace the 50th percentile FMRs with small area fair market rents instead. HUD's belief is that this will give tenants a more effective means to get into areas of higher opportunity and lower poverty areas by giving them higher subsidy for those high opportunity areas. Comments are due August 15th. We are still formulating our comments and are convening a call July 20th with our membership. If you're interested in participating, please reach out to me or Caitlin. We also have an earlier letter on our website that we'll link to in the notes to give from the advance notice of proposed rulemaking. That was last year. But this would impact 31 metro areas, and then other PHAs could opt in if they want to. So there's a lot to piece out with this. So again, please reach out, especially if you have comments. We'd love to hear from you. And then recently, Senator Menendez from New Jersey introduced a bill preventing abandoned foreclosures and Preserving Communities Act of 2016, focused on abandoned or incomplete foreclosures. So, as I'm sure most of you know, an abandoned foreclosure is when a servicer files for foreclosure. The homeowner moves out, but the servicer actually doesn't complete the foreclosure and the borrower has no idea. So the bill would require servicers to inform borrowers that they can stay in the home until state law requires them to move out. And servicers would also be required to make it clear to borrowers that they're still responsible for property taxes or assessments during the foreclosure process. And servicers would need to notify the borrower and the local government or municipality if they chose not to complete the foreclosure. I'm not sure this bill is really going to move in this Congress, but there's a lot of activity around addressing abandoned foreclosures at the state and at the state level too. So we are going to keep following this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Hi, thanks for that, Rebecca. So I'll just give a quick update on what HUD announced last week, and apologies in advance for my voice. I have a summer cold. So last week, HUD announced a pretty ambitious package of improvements for the Distressed Asset Stabilization Program. I think most of you on the call are familiar with the program, and FHA has taken some small steps over the past couple of years to improve it, but the steps they took last week were I think, far more meaningful than what they'd done in the past. And so the three main buckets of changes include a few things on loss mitigation, neighborhood stabilization, and improved reporting. On the loss mitigation side, they followed the lead of FHFA, which announced a package of changes in the spring for Fannie and Freddie, by saying that investors will need to evaluate homeowners for principal reduction as sort of the top of the waterfall. They've also prohibited, they've put standards in place to try and prevent loan modifications that result in payment shock. So, when a homeowner gets a modification, that's for 3 to 5 years, and then the payment, the terms revert to the original terms overnight. FHA has limited the sort of how quickly the interest rate can readjust to the original rate. I think 1% a year. On the neighborhood stabilization side of things, they've prohibited investors from walking away from vacant properties, and they've done a number of things to try and improve access for nonprofits and local governments in the auction process. So they are doing a pilot where they offer preferential bidding to nonprofits and local governments. Up to 5% they can bid on up to 5% of the assets in a pool. Their goal is through a variety of means to sell 10% of the non-performing loans and assets to nonprofits and local governments. And they propose a couple of ways in addition to this pilot at trying to increase participation and access for local governments and nonprofits. And then the last piece of, I think that's sort of the last bucket of improvements has to do with reporting. They're going to be reporting outcomes at a more granular level, which should be helpful because to date the performance reports coming out of FHA have been, kind of they've not been sufficiently granular for the public to really understand what's going on. And they've also said that they will be sharing demographic information about the pools that are sold at auction. So that's the basic summary. Over the summer, they will be, fine-tuning and figuring out exactly how they'll be implementing the changes. So I think, will be continued conversations with FHA. But the announcement is great news and really represents an important step forward.
Thanks, Sarah. That's really helpful. I just saw a piece on, put you on the spot, but I was just wondering if you could touch on New York, I think, is trying to start bidding on or buying some of these loans from FHA. Are other states trying to get in the same position?
Well, so I can, and I know that Julia Gordon is also on the call, and she may be able to speak to this as well. But yeah, New York City had been negotiating a sale from FHA of notes for a while now, and the sale was finalized last week. And I believe they've created a fund to try and buy. It's a partnership between the city and a coalition of nonprofits in New York City. And I believe they will try and do more purchases. I think the hope is that both FHA and nonprofits and local governments can learn from this transaction and hopefully put a system in place that is easy to use going forward, because I know this particular sale took quite a while. I'm not sure whether there are other local governments looking into doing similar things, but it's possible someone else can speak to that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. It'll be really great to see FHA implement these changes and especially make the fall very interesting as they implement. So thanks for being with us, even though you're sick. We appreciate it.
Yeah, sure thing.
And now we're going to move on to our guest presentation from Dr. Charles Branagh, who is a professor of epidemiology, at the University of Pennsylvania and the faculty director of the Urban Health Lab. Just as a quick background for folks, much of his work is focused on human geography and place-based interventions. His studies have been replicated nationally and in U.S. cities and other countries. He's worked with the NIH and the CDC and national academies in the U.S., but also scientific organizations in Canada, the Netherlands, and other countries as well. He's currently focused on a series of natural experiments and randomized controlled field trials that alter urban environments to determine the effects on health and safety in multiple cities. And much of this work is done through the Urban Health Lab. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charles. And
hi.
Give us 1 second. Hi.
All right, you can hear me.
Yes.
So show my.
Yes.
Okay. So let's see. So you can see my screen now, right?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Thanks for inviting me to talk. I appreciate it.
Yes, we're very interested in hearing more about this work.
So what you see the screen? Let me see. What do you see when I do that?
You changing place.
Do you also see the webcam stuff on the same screen?
No.
Okay. Cool. Very cool. So thanks for inviting me to talk. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to your group. Sounds like I enjoyed the policy updates. Actually, I learned a lot. So very pleased to hear that. So I am an epidemiologist, and I often get tongue-tied saying the word epidemiology as well. So not only an epidemiologist, but I'm also trained as a geographer. So I have sort of this dual interest in spaces and places, and I thought I'd talk a little bit today about the impact of changing places and sort of how epidemiologists and scientists think about it. And so what do you think? I have about 20 minutes, right? 15 minutes?
Yes.
And then some questions after that, and I'll try to leave as much time as I can for that. So for those of you who are as old as I am, you may know where this is, where the Lucky 7 Tavern was, actually, and what movie this came from. It's from the original Rocky movie in 1976. And the Lucky 7 was a space, this is another screenshot from the movie, in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia. This is a great scene in this movie at the Lucky 7 where Rocky says, you know, there are creeps on every other block here in Kensington. He walks up to the Lucky 7 Tavern. There's a guy passed out on the stoop right there, and he picks him up and brings him inside and puts him in a booth in the warmth of the Lucky 7. I think the Lucky 7 is an interesting little narrative for thinking about the way our cities have changed in the past 40 or 50 years. In fact, the neighborhood of Kensington has lost a significant amount of its population. And the Lucky 7 was abandoned at one point, and went from looking like this to not looking like anything, to being torn down and being an open and empty lot in the subsequent 20 or 30 years. The lot, as many of these abandoned spaces do, people park on them, trash gets thrown on them, big appliances and other things get left on them, a lot of illegal dumping, and they just become a general mess and a nuisance for the community. And in fact, some early work that we did was showing that they were also correlated very closely with a lot of crimes in the community, especially gun crime. But we weren't really sure so what that meant, that sort of correlation. And then we stumbled upon a program that in Philadelphia, and a number of cities have it, although Philadelphia's, I will say, is somewhat unique, and I'll give you more details on in a minute, that takes a lot like this in 08. And the city of Philadelphia had more of these abandoned and vacant lots than any other city in the U.S. in 1999, before this program started converting them into relatively cleaned and greened spaces, these sorts of vacant lots. And again, you can see the progression of this space. And the question then came up to us. We were finding some correlations of these spaces in Philadelphia and several other cities, Youngstown, Ohio, Flint, Michigan, Camden, New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey, New Orleans, Louisiana, and other places. The question was, well, how do we know if changes, like at the Lucky 7, meaning taking that abandoned space, making it clean and green, made things better for people in the surrounding neighborhood or not? And really the best way to answer this is to take a good scientific approach, much the same as we would study people who got aspirin and people who got sugar pill or a placebo, and see if their headache went away or not. We can apply the same scientific methods to see whether or not putting in grass and astroturf, or perhaps putting in grass or not making any changes to a space, reduce various health outcomes, health and safety outcomes. I put stress on here as one example, but there are many other health outcomes, and we consider, and I'm going to talk a lot about gun violence here, and urban gun violence as an outcome here, and we do think of that as a public health issue and a health outcome. So whether or not people get shot on or near those spaces. And then you can also take this to the next level scientifically and actually do random assignment, the same way we would do in drug trials. You can randomly assign which spaces get certain things and which don't, and determine the outcomes at the highest level of scientific inquiry. And in fact, the Office of Management and Budget in the White House has begun to really formally encourage these sorts of randomized controlled trials, or what are called quasi-experimental studies, which don't involve that sort of random assignment, but still are a very high level of science, because they want to begin to distinguish evidence, and what's weak evidence versus strong evidence, and they also want to begin to measure the cost effectiveness or the cost benefit of these sorts of strategies. You know, what if I put $1 in, how much will I get back as a city? How much will the taxpayers get back? How much will society get back for every dollar invested in these sorts of things? Probably one of the biggest examples of a large experiment that began in the early 90s was this Moving to Opportunity study, where it was a 3-arm experiment where residents, low-income residents, were assigned housing vouchers in 3 groups, randomly assigned. One group got housing vouchers to move out of poverty, another group got housing vouchers to move everywhere, and then a third group that had been randomly chosen by lottery received no vouchers. And these are thousands of people in these groups, so it was a very large study. And what they found was that indeed there was, in the experimental group, the group that got housing vouchers to move out of poverty, there was less obesity, diabetes went down, and their unhappiness went down, although there were some unintended consequences. There was more depression and conduct disorder, especially for adolescent boys. But in general, there was some success of moving people out of poverty. Questions came up, though. It is very much a landmark scientific work showing the impact of place, and where you live really matters. But the question still came up are we really going to move people as a place-based policy? I mean, is this ethical, first off, to do it en masse? And is it cost effective to do this en masse? And then, in fact, in the experimental group, the researchers here studied the effect of the housing vouchers, but you can't force people to move. You can only give them the voucher, and only about half of them use the voucher to move out of poverty. So even with a program like this, only half of the people that you're trying to move will actually move. So at the Urban Health Lab, we've been thinking a lot more about what we call in situ, or in situ interventions, or place-based programs that allow people to stay in place. Things that change the neighborhood around them, as opposed to try to move them out of the neighborhood to a different neighborhood. We think of these as programs that change the very structure of neighborhoods, that are not expensive, and in being not expensive, they are scalable to many different areas in the city, and they're also actually much more sustainable, because the maintenance of these small programs, smallish programs, which cumulatively add up to a big program for a city, but are done in many, many places across the city. And I'm going to tell you about two of these today. One is with abandoned buildings, treatments that we've been studying, and the second is, I think, what you had asked me to originally speak about, which is the greening of vacant lots, and the example I'd given you from the Rocky movie. And so both of these are opportunities, low-cost opportunities to treat a lot of different places. They are not luxury treatments. We're not making luxury parks or building luxury developments in cities. And so the cost is very low, and so they can be spread to a lot of different people and can have quite an impact on people's day-to-day lives. So I want to tell you about the abandoned buildings and the vacant lots. So first, the greening of the vacant lots is a public-private venture in the city of Philadelphia between the municipality itself, the city itself, and the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, which is the oldest horticultural society in the U.S. This is a very inexpensive, about $1,600 per lot on average, and about $180 a year to maintain it. That translates into about $1.25 a square foot. And it's a very simple treatment where you take what's on the left of your screen and you convert it into what's on the right, simply by cleaning the land, grading the land, planting a few trees. This is not an urban forestry initiative, so it's a select number of trees, but then also putting a fence around the space to show that it's cared for and to deter illegal dumping, which actually it's been very, very effective to do, that sort of fencing around the space. So this is the one program, and we took this into a larger study where we observed what had been done in the city over a decade, and that was about 4,400 lots that had received this full greening treatment. We compared that to about 13,000 lots in the city that had not received it. So their before-after is really more like a before-before. And in fact, there were a number of outcomes that were affected by this in terms of the surrounding neighborhood and the people there. But the one that we have most delved into is the significant reduction in gun violence, about 8%, that was sustained for years to come in the areas that got the treatment. And the return on this investment is quite high. For every dollar put in, it's about a $26 return to taxpayers for this investment. So that's a lot. It's an even higher return on investment to society at large. Our economists have calculated that out as well. The second one I wanted to tell you about is this more recent approach that we've done of fixing abandoned buildings. This is a little bit more expensive than the vacant lots. The maintenance is roughly the same year to year, and this is where you find abandoned buildings that, as you can see, the plywood on this building on the left, and it's just a mess. You have some of the eaves that are falling down and so forth. You basically clean the facade of the building, replace the doors and windows, pick up the trash, take off any graffiti that might be there. And this again is inexpensive, but it gives the impression that the building is lived in, and we thought that it might be an opportunity to deter various crimes. Again, we looked at about 600 of these spaces before and after, and compared it to, in this case, the same amount of spaces that had not had that change in them. And again, we found a much larger drop in gun violence that was not sustained for as long because we weren't able to study this more than a year or so after the change in the buildings. And the return was less in terms of for every dollar in, you receive $5 back. But still, that's pretty good. And that's a very large, significant drop in gun violence in the spaces around here. In both cases, we think that this is operating in a number of ways. One is that people become more invested in their spaces. And if something goes wrong in the space, then they are willing to call 911 or take charge and informally police that space once it's been cleaned, either the buildings or the vacant lots. And the other reason we think that the gun violence in particular has gone down is because we've done a lot of field work on this, and we think these spaces, whether they be vacant lots or abandoned buildings, are, quote, storage lockers for illegal firearms in neighborhoods. And so there are a lot of challenges in terms of for these neighborhoods in terms of how many illegal guns are in the neighborhood. And if you take the opportunity to store these illegal firearms away, we think there's a genuine reduction, and not simply a reduction in gun violence that pushes it around the corner, but a genuine reduction in gun violence in the area around the remediated spaces, whether they be lots or buildings. We've also now taken this and done a little bit more experimentation. We had another study where we cleaned and greened vacant lots the same way I just showed you, and we took residents on walks. Everyone got the same walk before and after the cleaning and the greening, and we put heart rate monitors and GPS monitors on them to know exactly where they were and what their heart rate was at every step they took and every point on their walk. And what you see here on the right is a map of one of the walks, and the green areas are the spaces from which they can see the newly greened lots. The gray areas are the spaces where, because there are many vacant lots in these areas, and we only randomly picked a few of them in each neighborhood to clean, the gray areas are the vacant lots that were never cleaned and greened. And what we found in this study was that there was a significant drop in heart rate when people were in view of the newly greened lots. So this is even further biologic evidence that cleaning and greening and improving neighborhood spaces improves people's health, and we also have additional evidence that there's been a reduction in stress that people report back, and improvements in mental health and happiness that people report when they're living near the newly greened spaces. So there's a lot of great opportunity here for very little cost. We're also now in the process of 2 active community randomized trials. This is where, for the vacant lots, we have about 600 vacant lots that have been enrolled to be changed. For the abandoned buildings, about 300 have been enrolled. And in the vacant lots, 200 of them, they're broken into groups of a third each. In the vacant lots, 200 of them get the full treatment, that is cleaning, greening, and people show up every month to maintain the space. A third of them get only the cleaning and maintenance, no greening, and then there's a control lot. And we do something similar for the abandoned buildings. Both of these trials are currently active. In fact, the vacant lot one is coming to a close right now, and we've got some very interesting findings that interestingly, so different time, different place, they mirror the prior studies where we observed what the city was doing. So in multiple large studies, we are showing the impact of these sorts of remediations on both gun violence, but also things like mental health outcomes and stress. And then we have reproduced this now in Youngstown, Ohio, where we found similar impacts of greening, or what they're calling stabilization of vacant lots, where the stabilized lots had significantly greater reductions in crimes. And in fact, the reductions in crimes went up even more in Youngstown. We didn't have the opportunity to study that in Philadelphia. When you combined greening with active use, where the neighbors were brought into the lots to reuse them for various purposes, as opposed to just sort of letting the use happen organically, which is what often happens anyways. But if you actively bring people in, at least for the short term, to think about use of the newly green spaces, they actually take to it a little bit more and may even reduce crime further. And then we've been working in a number of other cities. The ones in red are the ones we've been working in most closely up to now to do both abandoned building remediations and vacant lot work. And in all these cities, we take the time to connect with our university and scientific partners in those cities, who make introductions to usually city government, but also other private organizations, community development corporations, and others who work with us and their local universities to both do the treatments to these spaces, but also whenever the opportunity presents itself, we try to evaluate the impact of those treatments. And that's all I got. Is there more time?
Yeah. Thank you. That's really fascinating. It's rare, I think, maybe not rare, but at least rare for me to get to kind of the scientific view of some of the work that we spend all our time thinking about and trying to move forward, and to see it from this aspect is really fascinating. Just as a reminder to folks, feel free to send questions through the question box. And while you are thinking about those, we will, I'm sure we have some here in the room. I don't know if I have a question exactly, but I was thinking about the research of greening vacant lots versus abandoned buildings. And there can be this question in communities about when to demolish. So I'm just wondering maybe what your experience has been, or what your research is showing about tipping point may not be the right way to think about it, but when the benefit is better to demolish versus dealing with the abandoned building as it is for the community in terms of health and violence and crime.
Well, I think that's a great question, and I rarely get asked that question, and we've been asked to consult in Baltimore, which is going on I think pretty much a mass demolition effort, and we haven't studied it yet. I think it deserves good scientific study, but I mean, my experience here is the Philadelphia experience, where one of the reasons that we had more vacant lots than any other city in 99-2000 was because the city underwent, through one of its programs, a mass demolition. But they did it, at the time, the administration did it without a whole lot of thinking about what happens once the buildings are razed. And we understood that the buildings, many of them were, in threat of imminent collapse, is the city's definition. So they were dangerous, no doubt about it. But I think the advice I had given in Baltimore was that I don't think demolition necessarily is bad, but there needs to be a plan for what's going to happen to the space after the demolition happens. It can't just, so in Philadelphia, many times the construction debris was just left for years, if not a decade afterwards, and this just bred a lot of problems for those neighborhoods. So demolition is easy and quick, but it needs to be more thought through with a post-demolition plan, I think, is the short answer. And we really should be studying the impact of these demolitions. There's a great opportunity in Baltimore right now that we're hoping to be a part of, to study it, to see what is the impact of demolition, and should we be doing it, and if so, how should we be doing it?
Yeah, we actually had the City of Baltimore present to us recently about kind of where they're headed with their strategic demolition. So it is a really interesting time for the city, for sure. So we had a question from one of the task force members about return on investment and how your economists calculated that for greening vacant lots.
Sure. Well, we knew the input costs, right, from the Horticulture Society. So I've given you the costs per lot on average, but we knew it exactly for every lot that they did. And the cost of the crimes, so we had these only calculated for crimes because we have good data on that, and really we only focused on gun crimes. But the costs for the crimes were based on what's called a willingness to pay metric. So there's a number of good economic studies on what people would be willing to pay to avert a crime, for instance, a gun crime in their neighborhood. And that translates into what the return on investment is. Now, that does sound, you could do it a different way. They're about the same. There are ways to basically add up the costs. You know, what's the cost of if someone's shot, of their medical care, and the cost of the justice system and so forth. Economists don't think that's as good a metric as asking people what they would be willing to pay to avert something like that. It's basically, what is the market willing to deal with? So those are how we dealt with those numbers and how our economists came up with the calculations.
Great, that's really helpful. Other questions in the room? Go ahead, Jonathan.
This is Jonathan Horowitz. I'm with the Low Income Investment Fund now, and I really appreciate this presentation. And I just kind of want to jump off the last question a little bit.
Sure.
Because well, I've had several prior lives, but the very first one in this area was working with your UPenn colleague, Dennis Culhane.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, who did, obviously, I mean, took the other approach to calculating costs. And, you know, we've all been engaged. I think, well, first of all, I want to take a step back and say thank you for the presentation, and also for the focus on what I call the first generation of moving to opportunity findings.
Yeah.
You know, in our world, you know, understandably, the second generation, led by Roger Chetty and others, has really been, you know, incredibly popular. And those of us who saw the first phase of findings, and I was working at HUD at the time, those were really important. So here's the punchline is sort of, okay, so we think a lot about how do we get people to pay for these things that we're now, you know, seeing incredible impact of. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts based on the experience in Philadelphia and other places, sort of the coming out of the Culhane supportive housing research. You have the kind of social impact bond idea of like, okay,
yep,
let's bump these savings, et cetera, which has not been as easy as we all hoped. So now
yep,
you've got the willingness to pay, you know, this is a general, you know, what thoughts do you have around this?
Well, you know, one of the reasons that we are pursuing these structural, scalable, sustainable endeavors, you know, they could be, we deal with many things. You know, it's not just buildings and land. We also have some that work in transportation issues and other things. I mean, but we're really looking for low-cost things that can be spread around and that have an impact. So that's part of the hope of willingness to pay and getting municipalities to invest in, and that's why I think a number of municipalities have taken an interest in these, as opposed to perhaps more expensive strategies. You know, we've had police departments call this examples of, you know, these are examples of soft policing for the crime outcomes, and the cost of these is far less than new patrols. And new patrols are only as good as when they're in the neighborhood, new police patrols, right? So they work, but they need to be maintained at all times because we have good evidence that once they are taken out of the neighborhood, the crime returns. Whereas for things like this, especially if you can push a neighborhood to a tipping point, to stop that sort of blight and abandonment from growing, then you're going to have more of a sustained effect, and you may be able to do it at a really low cost. So that's part of my answer. But the other answer that I have is, I think a lot of these cities that, maybe experimented with a pilot program in vacant lot maintenance or an, abandoned building remediation, only did it as a pilot, and then we're sort of going to shelve it for something else. And in fact, doing the studies have really energized a number of the policymakers to be able to see the value of this. And I'll tell you, there are a number of things that these don't affect, a number of outcomes, many outcomes that were unaffected, right? But the select few, especially the gun violence, city leaders seem to be very much behind that. For many of these cities, that's a major problem that's in the fore. And so that if they can see evidence, scientific evidence that seems to have them perhaps double down on some smaller pilot programs that they can expand on in these endeavors. And then the last thing I'll say is, you're right, the social impact bond approach, and we've been having discussions about that with a number of cities and corporate investors, because I do think this would be a perfect opportunity for social impact bonds, although those are, we're finding they're very hard to pull off. But if you can pull it off, it would be pretty amazing.
Thanks so much for the answer. I'll let others jump in, but I'll just, make a little plug potentially to all of us as we head into a new administration. I don't know in particular whether the neighborhood stabilization program, in any of these places played any role, but at one point in time, we heard from Sarah earlier about, FHFA, et cetera, but there was once an opportunity to invest $5 billion in this kind of work, and it sort of seems 8 years later, we now have in one particular area, neighborhood stabilization program was designed to do a broad range of things, but, this is pretty incredible, and if the federal government, could make some investment at scale, it would be, it seems like it would pay off tremendously. I know I'm talking to the choir here, but.
No, and so, it's great interaction. So, these programs, what we found when we went into the cities, these were all designed for economic stability and economic development, right? So the greening of the vacant lots in all these cities is so if a developer were driving around the neighborhood and it didn't look horrible, right? It looked a little clean and manicured, perhaps they would purchase the open spaces and build on them. It's turned out, at least in the city of Philadelphia, that that's happened less than 10% of the time, but that's okay. I think, at least for the short term, that's okay, because those spaces as they are contribute to improvements in people's health, and that's sort of been our contribution here from the School of Medicine, is that, we have the business school here has shown that there is definitely an economic benefit to this. I didn't show you that. So property values do go up. But there is also, we think, a health benefit to having these spaces cleaned and greened, or the abandoned buildings remediated. And so that's sort of the additional thing. So there's a lot of co-benefits that go on with this. So an investor could be very interested in this because it would achieve a number of different ends.
And I think that's a good point. In general, when we do this neighborhood stabilization work, and we're coming at it from a holistic strategy, we're deploying multiple things usually, not just affordable housing, but we're looking at vacant spaces, we're looking at abandoned buildings, we're looking at workforce development. But we sometimes, I think, don't think through the outcomes as well, which looking at the first moving to opportunity study versus the second. The mental health benefits were kind of overlooked in some circles, even though those are really important, because if you have the mental health, then you're more able to take on changing other aspects of your life. But we don't always look at all the co-benefits that we put in this work, and I think that's also something to keep in mind going forward, that it's not just property values, but it's mental health and it's crime, and we can have a lot of powerful impacts with this kind of work.
But these are fundamental structures in people's lives, right? So, I've spent years dealing with the medical side of things, waiting for the negative health effects. and the violence to occur and waiting for people to come to the hospital. So we really wanted to go upstream on this and think about, well, what's generating it in the first place. And these sorts of things that you guys have been thinking about for decades is what you do primarily. These are really important, not just to what you would think are the obvious outcomes like economic outcomes, but they're also important to other things like health. Very great questions.
Well, I think we will wrap up, but we really, again, appreciate you presenting to us. This has been really interesting and helpful for us. And folks, we will send out a link to the recording per our usual, and if you have questions that come up after the fact, please reach out, and we will try to get you answers.
Can I just want to ask one quick thing before we go, which is, have you Philadelphia is such a great case study area. Do you interact at all with the Reinvestment Fund, which is we're a community development financial institution, and they're one of our closest and largest partners. I'm just wondering if you had any direct connection with them.
We have, but it's been fleeting. I would like to have more of a connection. I think some of the connection we've had with them is discussions of neighborhood typologies and the impact this might have on gentrification. So we've used some of their work in that regard, but we've not necessarily interacted with them directly. I'd be happy to have if you made a connection, it'd be great.
Yeah, no, happy to do that, because they're, what's interesting is having worked very closely with them, I don't want to speak for them, but they have policy men. They're doing an incredible amount in trying to look at neighborhood level outcomes that are almost, as Rebecca was sort of saying, looking at things like, percentage of building permits over $50,000 that are, going to CDCs and nonprofits, vacancy rates, things like that I think would be very powerful to couple together. So I can follow up offline on that.
Thank you very much.
And yeah, one more question from the room.
Yeah, so I'm curious to hear what you would say to cities who are on the call who are interested in replicating something similar or getting involved with your work, and what advice you would give them.
So another great comment. We're trying to evolve with some foundation funding what we're calling a DIYC, do it in your city. So when we find some kind of low-cost, structural, scalable, sustainable intervention like these, we're trying to sort of bottle it and come up with a protocol for how to do it in your city, but also some examples in other cities where they are perhaps very well developed in doing it. So for these two I've given you, if you do have an interest in replicating this in your city, we don't have this hasn't fully been completed, this do it in your city approach, but if you do want to, we can put you in touch with people in other cities who have been doing it for decades perhaps and have some pretty firm protocols. And I'll say, Philadelphia is, we found this out very acutely when we went to Milwaukee, for instance. Just the housing stock is so different, whether it be the buildings themselves or the parcels of land for perhaps something's been abandoned. It's just different parcels and sizes and the way the population interacts with the spaces. So we can put you in touch with various cities that have, that might be closer to the way your city is. Now you can see from the map that we don't have, I think you can still see that map that's up. We don't have many cities in the West or the Northwest that we've interacted with. Most of our cities are, northeastern legacy cities, but we'd be happy to put you in touch with folks in other cities who've done these programs. Or if you wanted to think about, perhaps, if it's not like your city, if you wanted to think about ways to tweak it so that it does apply to your spaces, we could work with you on that as well.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, with that we will close out this month's meeting, and just folks, we are not having an August meeting of the task force since we know lots of folks are already heading out on vacations, so we will reconvene in September 7th, I believe. So look forward to seeing all of you then, and thanks to our presenters, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.